A waitress glanced at his hand and whispered, "My mother owns a ring like yours." In that moment, Jameson Blackwood realized his empire was hiding a secret he was never meant to uncover. The gilded steer hummed with its usual symphony of fine dining, the clink of crystal glasses, the murmur of conversations polished smooth by wealth, the subtle shuffle of waiters who had perfected the art of invisibility. At a corner table near the kitchen doors, where no one of importance was ever seated, Jameson Blackwood sat in his chosen disguise, the thrift store jacket rough against his skin, the jeans faded just enough to pass for struggle. He had come here again, not for the food, but for the truth, to see his empire through the eyes of someone who believed he did not matter. His hand rested on the table, the old ring glinting faintly in the glow of the chandelier above, a private token he rarely noticed anymore. It had been his mother's gift when he first took the reins of Blackwood Holdings, a wolf's crest etched in gold, one of a kind, impossible to copy. He had always thought of it as a silent guard, a reminder of where he came from and the battles he had fought to stand at the top. Mara de la Cruz moved like someone who had learned to make herself small, efficient, polite, careful not to draw attention. Her black shoes were scuffed, her apron clean but worn, her posture professional, even as exhaustion clung to her shoulders. She set a basket of bread on the table, poured water with a steady hand, and then her eyes caught the ring. For a moment her practiced smile faltered, her gaze fixed on it as though it were a ghost. She drew a quiet breath and said in a voice only meant for him, "Hello, sir. My mother owns a ring like yours." The words were simple, polite, almost casual, yet they landed like a stone in Jameson's chest. The room did not notice. A pair of businessmen at the bar laughed too loudly at a joke. The hostess ushered in a group of silver-haired patrons in gowns and tuxedos. The waiters glided between tables with rehearsed charm. Everything continued, but Jameson felt the air shift. His pulse quickened as his eyes locked onto the young waitress. He studied her face, her steady brown eyes, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun with strands that refused to stay, her expression calm but not rehearsed. She had not meant to startle him, she had simply told the truth. Yet what she said was impossible. The ring on his finger was unique. His mother had assured him no copy existed, no second crest ever carved. It had been her final act of defiance in a world of men who believed wealth erased history. For Mara to claim her mother owned the same ring was unthinkable. Jameson forced a neutral smile, though his stomach tightened. "Is that so?" he said softly, his voice pitched to sound casual. Mara nodded once, her hands clasped before her apron. "Yes, sir," she answered. "My mother has one, though hers is older, maybe. She never takes it off." She moved away then, back into the rhythm of service, as though she had not just ripped open a secret Jameson thought untouchable. He sat frozen, his hand still resting on the table, the wolf's crest gleaming under the light, no longer a silent guard, but a question he could not ignore. The gilded steer was built to impress, its marble floors polished until they shone like water, its chandeliers scattering light in 1,000 directions, its leather seats deep and welcoming for those who could afford them. Every detail was meant to whisper power and perfection, but Jameson Blackwood, sitting at the table nearest the kitchen doors, could suddenly see the cracks beneath the shine. The moment Mara de la Cruz spoke about the ring, the air around him shifted. He studied her carefully as she moved away, her back straight, her hands steady, yet he could hear what she carried beneath the calm. Her shoes told their own story, the black leather worn thin, the soles close to breaking, each step a quiet testimony to long hours and little rest. Her uniform was clean but tired, the apron creased from too many shifts, the shirt ironed but fraying faintly at the cuffs. She carried herself with dignity, but Jameson had lived long enough to recognize the tremor hiding in her stillness. The dining room continued its performance as though nothing had changed. A suited man raised a glass of red wine and toasted his companion with laughter that sounded just a little too loud. A pair of women in silk dresses compared diamonds that glittered under the lights. Waiters moved in well, rehearsed arcs, their smiles smooth and practiced. To any other eye it was flawless, but to Jameson the scene looked suddenly fragile. The carefully constructed choreography of wealth and courtesy, once a comfort, now appeared brittle, as if one sharp word could shatter it all. He found himself turning the ring on his finger, feeling the weight of it in a way he had not felt in years. What had once been a private symbol, something meant only for him, was now a question mark burning on his hand. He could not let it go. Mara had spoken with no calculation, no hint of flattery, no attempt to charm. Her words had carried a quiet truth, and it unsettled him more than all the false smiles in the room. Jameson had built a life of control, every boardroom, every contract, every deal meticulously prepared, yet here in his own flagship restaurant, disguised in thrift store clothes, he had been caught off guard by a single sentence from a waitress whose eyes held more honesty than all the reports stacked on his desk. He watched her weave between tables, carrying plates, offering refills, bowing her head slightly as if shielding herself from the world's weight. But when she glanced back toward him, her eyes steady and searching, he felt a strange recognition, as though she saw more of him than anyone else dared. The ring pressed heavy against his skin, no longer just gold, but a fracture line that had opened beneath polished marble. He tried to dismiss it, to remind himself that coincidence sometimes disguised itself as fate, yet the thought refused to settle. Mara's words clung to him, reshaping the night. For the first time in years, Jameson Blackwood felt the foundation of his carefully ordered world shift, and he knew this was only the beginning. The clamor of the dining room faded around Jameson, though the orchestra of clinking glasses and low laughter played on without pause. He felt suspended in a space that belonged only to him and the young waitress standing at his table. Mara had returned with his drink, and when he thanked her in a quiet voice, she hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the ring again. He let the silence stretch, his gaze steady, waiting for her to say more. She shifted her weight as if bracing herself, then spoke softly, words carefully chosen but carrying the weight of memory. "My mother's name is Angela Dela Cruz," she said, "and long before she worked double shifts here, she worked in a studio, a luxury atelier that made heirlooms for families most people only read about in magazines." Her voice held both pride and hesitation, as though she was sharing something sacred, a piece of history rarely spoken aloud. Jameson felt his chest tighten. He had heard of countless ateliers, small houses of craft scattered across Europe and America, but he knew only one that matched the detail she gave. He leaned forward slightly, his disguise slipping in that small gesture, and asked her to continue. Mara's eyes lowered to the ring, her voice lowering too, as if the words themselves were dangerous. "My mother told me the crest means wolves who guard," she whispered. "That is what she said when I was little, that the family who ordered it wanted a reminder of loyalty and protection. She never said who they were, only that the piece was special, and she was proud to have worked on it." The room seemed to tilt, the chandeliers swaying in Jameson's vision, though he knew they were still. Wolves who guard. The words hit him with the force of memory, carrying him back to his mother's study high above the streets of Chicago, her steady hands sliding a small velvet box across the desk to him on the day he signed his first deal. Inside had been the ring, heavy with meaning, its crest sharp and certain. She had leaned close, her voice low and commanding, and told him that the wolves would remind him who he was meant to protect and what he must never surrender. It had been her private commission, handled by an artisan no one else knew, sworn to secrecy. She had promised him it was the only one. Jameson's jaw tightened, though he forced his expression calm. He searched Mara's face for any hint of calculation, but there was none. Only quiet truth, only the steadiness of someone who had learned to stand firm in a world that gave her little reason to. He realized then that she did not know who he was. To her he was just a man in worn clothes at a bad table, but she had still shared the story without expectation, without any motive but honesty. He leaned back, slowly, his mind a storm beneath the still surface. The crest was not meant to exist beyond his hand, yet here it was, echoing from the past through a waitress whose mother had touched the same gold. A name he had not heard in years had risen in the middle of his empire, and Jameson Blackwood understood that nothing about this night would remain ordinary. Mara's return to his table was quiet, almost hesitant, as though she knew she had already said too much but could not leave the matter untouched. She carried herself with the same calm grace, yet her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, a hesitation that caught Jameson's attention more than the polished service around him. She leaned slightly closer as if shielding her words from the other guests, and asked softly if she could show him something. Jameson gave the faintest nod, his curiosity outweighing caution, and Mara slipped her phone from the pocket of her apron. She unlocked it with a practiced swipe, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her nerves, and turned the screen toward him. The photo she held out was old and grainy, its colors faded by time, but the image was unmistakable. A younger woman, smiling in a way that spoke of pride more than wealth, stood in a modest living room, with sunlight filtering through thin curtains. Her dark hair framed a face that carried the same steady eyes Mara now carried, and on her hand, gleaming even through the blur of the photograph, was a ring identical to the one Jameson wore. His breath caught, though he kept his expression carefully neutral, his hand tightening slightly on the edge of the table. The wolf's crest, small yet sharp, gleamed from the band. He studied the image closer, his trained eye catching a detail almost hidden from view. On the inside curve of the band, barely visible in the photograph, was a mark he recognized. It was the artisan's seal, a discreet signature placed only on bespoke commissions. Jameson remembered seeing it etched on his own ring, and he remembered his mother explaining that the seal was proof of authenticity, a mark known only to a handful of families who trusted this specific atelier. His mind reeled as he noticed the date stamped faintly at the bottom corner of the photo, an old camera timestamp that placed it years before his own mother had gifted him his ring. He felt a strange chill work its way through him. If Angela Dela Cruz had worn that ring before the fire, then the promise of uniqueness his mother had sworn was broken, or worse, it had been stolen, duplicated, and hidden away. He glanced at Mara, who stood silently, her lips pressed together as though waiting for judgment. She whispered that the photo was taken before the atelier closed, before the fire that her mother refused to speak about, before she stopped wearing the ring at all. Mara's voice wavered as she admitted she had not seen it in years, only remembered how tightly her mother had once clutched it, as though it carried both pride and sorrow. Jameson returned his gaze to the photo, the faded image that now felt like a ghost pulled out of the past, proof of something that should not exist. His empire, built on certainty and control, shifted beneath him. He could no longer dismiss Mara's words as coincidence. The truth glimmered from that small photograph, a truth that tied his family's most private symbol to hers. The ring on his finger no longer felt like his alone, and in that moment Jameson knew his world had cracked open wider than he was ready to admit. The elevator opened directly into Jameson Blackwood's penthouse, a space of glass and steel that overlooked the restless glow of Chicago. The city stretched out beneath him, but tonight its skyline felt distant, unreal, as though it belonged to another man. He slipped off the thrift store jacket he had worn to the Gilded Steer and laid it across a chair, his eyes falling once again to the ring on his finger. The weight of Mara's words clung to him, and the image of the photograph she had shown him lingered like a ghost. He poured a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the light, and sank into the leather chair near the wide window. His mind refused rest. There was only one man he trusted to untangle the knot this night had given him, and so he reached for the secure phone on his desk and dialed Arthur Pendleton. Arthur answered after a single ring, his voice calm as ever, the voice of a man who had guided storms into order for decades. Jameson wasted no time. He explained the waitress, the ring, the photo, and the name of her mother, Angela Dela Cruz. His tone was steady, but edged with something he rarely allowed Arthur to hear, a trace of unease. On the other end, there was silence for a moment, then the quiet rustle of papers and the rhythmic clicking of Arthur's keyboard. When Arthur spoke again, it was in the measured cadence Jameson relied on. He had already begun pulling threads. Within minutes, Arthur traced the atelier. It had been a small but highly respected house of design, known only to certain families who commissioned bespoke heirlooms. The records showed a fire had destroyed the studio, its archives, and its client books nearly 2 decades ago. Insurance claims had been filed, employees paid off, the matter closed. Yet something in the paperwork caught Arthur's eye, and Jameson heard the shift in his tone. The atelier, Arthur explained, had not simply vanished. Its remnants had been folded quietly into a subsidiary of Blackwood Holdings, though not under jewelry or luxury goods. The acquisition was hidden under hospitality, a line item that made no sense, as if someone had tried to bury it in the wrong decade of files. Jameson stood, moving to the floor, to ceiling windows, the glass cold against his palm as he stared at the city. He asked Arthur to read the details again, each word sharpening the outline of a puzzle that had lain dormant beneath his empire. The numbers were small, insignificant compared to the billions he controlled, yet the placement was deliberate. Someone had taken care to disguise the acquisition, to place it where no one would think to look. Jameson's mind raced as he considered what that meant. The atelier had not simply burned, it had been absorbed, and in that absorption, perhaps the secret of the rings had been buried. Arthur's voice broke into his thoughts, calm but firm. "This is no coincidence," he said, and Jameson knew it was true. The first thread had been pulled, and already the fabric of his certainty was beginning to unravel. The night outside glittered with the cold beauty of wealth, but Jameson understood something darker lay beneath it, waiting to be uncovered. Jameson had always trusted Arthur to steady the ship, but there were storms Arthur preferred to watch from the charts rather than sail into. For that, Jameson relied on Wren, the quiet shadow who lived between the lines of legality and necessity. She arrived at the penthouse without ceremony, a slim duffel at her side, her dark hair cropped short, her eyes sharp and unreadable. Wren never wasted words, but when Jameson explained what Mara had told him and what Arthur had uncovered, she listened with the patience of someone who had learned to hear the space between sentences. Then she opened her laptop, the glow of the screen catching the edge of her profile, and began pulling at the threads that Jameson could not reach alone. She started with the atelier fire, her fingers moving with speed across the keys. Within minutes, she had gathered the insurance claims, the payout figures, and the list of employees compensated. To the untrained eye, it all looked legitimate, the kind of paperwork that ended stories neatly. But Wren's rule was simple, and she said it aloud as though to remind Jameson of the ground they stood on. There are no coincidences, only patterns hiding in plain sight. She sifted through the data with relentless focus, tracing transfers that moved like veins through the corporate body. Soon a pattern emerged, subtle at first but undeniable the longer she stared at it. The fire had coincided with claims on several high-value pieces, commissions that should have been lost forever. Yet within years, nearly identical heirlooms began surfacing in private auctions across Europe and Asia. Wren pulled images onto the screen, photographs from catalogs, grainy shots from discreet collectors' brochures. Rings, pendants, and crests, too specific to be coincidence, each one bearing hallmarks that matched the supposedly destroyed pieces. Jameson leaned closer, his breath tight, as he recognized one or two from whispered conversations in his world, pieces that had been dismissed as forgeries. But Wren's tone was certain. They were not forgeries, she said. They were duplicates, second versions crafted quietly, before the originals were reported destroyed. Her cursor hovered over the insurance company's name, the same boutique firm listed in every payout. She dug deeper, and soon their underwriters connected to shell corporations, each linked by the faintest trace to holding companies that circled back toward subsidiaries Jameson owned but had never controlled directly. His stomach tightened as he realized how close this had been to him all along, hidden under his own empire, yet designed to stay invisible. Wren clicked through another file, showing auction proceeds routed through discrete accounts, the sums modest compared to his billions, but heavy with implication. She leaned back finally, folding her arms across her chest, her voice flat but firm. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just theft. It was a system built on trust in secrecy, moving heirlooms from fire to market, with the blessing of insurance and the silence of those too frightened to speak. Jameson stared at the glowing screen. The evidence lined before him, and felt the floor of certainty shift once more. The ring on his finger was no longer just a family crest. It was proof of a pattern, and Wren's rule was already proving true. The address Mara had written on a slip of paper led Jameson far from the glass towers he was used to, past rows of aging brick buildings and flickering streetlights that hummed with tired electricity. The car eased to a stop in front of a narrow apartment block with peeling paint and a sagging awning, the kind of place that carried more stories than comfort. He stepped out quietly, dressed not in his usual armor of tailored suits, but in a plain coat and dark slacks, clothes that would not announce who he was. The hallway smelled faintly of cooking oil and damp plaster, and as he climbed the stairs he felt each creak of the wooden steps beneath his weight. This was Mara's world, a world built on resilience rather than opulence, and he entered it with an unfamiliar caution. When the door opened, Angela Dela Cruz stood framed in the small space, her posture straight though her eyes carried years of guarded fatigue. She was older than the photograph Mara had shown him, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined in ways that told of nights too long and burdens too heavy. She greeted him with a politeness that felt like a shield, her voice calm but distant, as though she had welcomed strangers too many times before and learned to protect herself with courtesy. Jameson noticed the limp as she stepped aside to let him in, a stiffness in her gait that had not been visible in the faded photo where she had worn her ring with pride. The apartment was neat but modest, the furniture carefully tended though worn, the scent of brewed coffee lingering in the air. On a small shelf sat a row of photographs in mismatched frames, Mara as a child, school portraits, birthdays marked with homemade cakes. There was no trace of wealth, only the evidence of love stretched thin across years of hardship. Angela motioned for him to sit, but when his hand rested briefly on the arm of the chair, the light caught the ring on his finger. For a moment she froze, her breath caught in her throat, her composure cracking just enough for him to see the shock beneath. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, and her voice faltered as she asked where he had gotten it. Jameson did not hide the truth. He told her it had been his mother's gift, a commission from an atelier she must know well, a ring that was never meant to have a twin. Angela lowered herself into the chair opposite him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. When she spoke, her voice was softer, touched with something that was neither anger nor relief, but a deep sorrow. The atelier did not burn, she said slowly. It was emptied. Every design, every commission, every record removed before the fire was set. They paid us to disappear, to carry silence like a debt, and those who resisted found themselves without work or worse. The words hung between them, heavy as stone. Jameson saw in her face the cost of that silence, the limp, the guarded tone, the walls built to protect her daughter from truths too dangerous to speak. For the first time in years he felt not like a man uncovering a conspiracy, but like a witness to grief that had never been given air. The empire he ruled felt distant in that modest room, and the ring on his finger had never weighed more heavily. Angela sat very still, her hands clasped together as though holding back tremors that wanted to betray her. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner of the apartment and the muffled sound of traffic from the street below. Jameson did not press her. He had learned long ago that silence could draw out more truth than sharp questions. Finally, Angela's shoulders slumped, as if she had carried the story too long, and no longer had the strength to keep it locked away. She drew in a steadying breath and began to speak, her voice low, each word weighted with memory. She told him about the night it happened, the night that had followed her ever since. There had been a late shipment, crates arriving after dusk, filled with precious metals and unfinished pieces waiting for the final touch. The atelier was alive with quiet urgency, artisans bending over their benches, tools in hand, polishing, engraving, coaxing beauty out of raw elements. Angela had been one of them, younger then, eager, her skill precise. She remembered the smell of metal dust and lacquer, the dim golden glow of the lamps overhead. But as the evening stretched on, she was summoned to the manager's office, a place she rarely entered. The man behind the desk was calm, too calm, his smile thin, as he explained that a client had requested duplicate proofs of several designs, a backup for safety in case of loss. Angela had never heard of such a practice, but the order came with authority she could not question. She and two others were told to work quickly, to craft the duplicates with absolute precision, to make them indistinguishable from the originals. She obeyed, her hand steady, though her heart was unsettled, each hammer strike and carved line feeling heavier than usual. When the duplicates were finished, she was told to place them in a velvet case and leave them in the locked office. The originals, she noticed, had also been moved, stacked carefully beside ledgers she had no clearance to read. Then came the instruction that gnawed at her even before she understood its meaning. She was told to leave early that night, before the alarm test. At the time it seemed like a strange kindness, a rare reprieve from long hours, and though suspicion lingered, she accepted. She gathered her things, nodded to the others, still bent over their work, and stepped into the cool night air. The next morning she returned to chaos. Smoke still clung to the air, though the flames had long been doused. The vault was bare, every design, every commission, every ledger gone. The fire had gutted the building, but it was too clean, too precise, more destruction than accident. The staff were gathered, their faces pale, their futures uncertain. A representative from the insurer arrived swiftly, offering payouts, urging signatures, promising silence would mean safety. Those who were loyal took the money, those who questioned were pushed aside, their reputations ruined before they could speak. Angela signed too, her hands trembling, her heart breaking, because she had Mara to protect. As she finished, her eyes lifted to Jameson's, weary yet defiant. "They emptied it," she whispered. "They burned only the shell, and left us with nothing but silence." Jameson felt the words like a blade, carving into truths his empire had never meant to face. And he knew the night of the switch was not only theft, but betrayal woven into the very foundation of his inheritance. Jameson did not sleep that night, the words of Angela Dela Cruz circling his thoughts like restless birds, reminding him that the fire he had always believed to be a tragic accident was nothing but a carefully staged performance. By dawn he was back in his penthouse office, the city still gray and hushed below, his ring pressing heavy against his skin as though demanding answers. Arthur Pendleton arrived with a slim folder under his arm and the same calm expression he always wore, though Jameson could see the sharp focus in his eyes. Arthur had spent the night combing through decades of records, tracing the ghostly paper trail that careless men always believed they could hide. Arthur spread the documents across the desk with meticulous precision, pointing to a cluster of files buried deep within the antique portfolio of Blackwood Holdings. At first glance they looked like nothing more than dormant accounts, names lost to time, but Arthur's pen circled one subsidiary with steady certainty. Argent Crest Logistics. The name was bland, designed to disappear, yet it had been folded quietly under hospitality when it clearly had no business being there. Jameson leaned forward as Arthur continued, his voice calm but edged with steel. Argent Crest had been overseen by a director named Silas Rourke, a man Arthur described as polished, ambitious, and known for speaking in phrases that sounded like promises but carried no meaning. His official title had been Director of Asset Optimization, a phrase that told Jameson everything and nothing. Arthur handed him a memo. The paper yellowed at the edges, though the words remained sharp. The memo referenced paired originals, a phrase repeated across several commissions. For every heirloom requested, there were to be 2 versions crafted, indistinguishable in design. One was to be delivered to the rightful client, the other quietly retained. Jameson read the words twice, his jaw tightening as the betrayal became plain. This was not theft in the shadows, but theft disguised as procedure, signed off by men who believed no one would ever question them. He turned to another sheet, a letter written in smooth corporate language, signed by Rourke himself. It praised efficiency, celebrated reduced loss risk, and framed the duplications as a safeguard. Jameson recognized the strategy at once, the way corruption disguised itself as innovation, hiding betrayal inside polished phrases. He thought of his mother commissioning the wolf's crest, believing in its uniqueness, and felt a sharp anger rise in his chest. The truth was laid bare by paper, cold and undeniable. Arthur stood silently as Jameson traced the lines with his finger, the words burning into memory. Paired originals, 2 rings for 1 commission, 1 to keep, 1 to sell. The proof was here, in memos and signatures, in dates that aligned too neatly with the night Angela had been told to leave early. Paper did not lie, and these documents revealed the machinery that had turned loyalty into profit. Jameson lifted his gaze, his voice low but firm. "Find everything on Silas Rourke," he said, because this was no longer a question of coincidence. It was a reckoning waiting to be delivered. Jameson Blackwood returned to the Gilded Steer, not in the thrift-store jacket, but in the armor the world knew him by. A charcoal suit cut to perfection, a watch that glinted under the light, shoes polished to a mirror finish. He did not come to hide this time, he came to be seen, and the staff who had once dismissed him in worn clothes now scrambled with anxious courtesy. The maitre d' bowed deeply. The hostess stammered as she led him to a private room near the back, a space reserved for those who wanted both discretion and spectacle. Jameson accepted their service with polite silence, his expression calm, though beneath the surface his mind moved like sharpened steel. Tonight was not about food, it was about bait. He had sent the invitation earlier that morning, phrased as a celebration, a toast to recovery after a challenging quarter, a chance to congratulate a loyal director who had kept the company efficient. Silas Rourke had accepted without hesitation, his reply smooth and gracious, filled with the kind of flattery Jameson had come to expect from men who polished their words more than their integrity. Rourke arrived 15 minutes after Jameson, his suit impeccable, his smile practiced, his handshake firm. He spoke with warmth as though the two were old allies, but Jameson saw the calculation in his eyes. Mara was the one assigned to serve, her face composed though her eyes widened when she saw Jameson revealed, no longer the quiet man in worn clothes, but the billionaire owner himself. She carried herself with the same dignity as always, her voice steady as she asked what he would like to drink. Yet Jameson caught the flicker of recognition, the understanding that tonight was not an ordinary service. He gave her a slight nod, a silent reassurance, and ordered a vintage wine. Mara poured with careful grace, the tremor gone from her hand, as though the truth she carried had hardened her into something stronger. Wren was already there, invisible to most eyes, blending with the quiet bustle of staff, preparing the room. She moved like a shadow, setting the table, adjusting the floral centerpiece with deliberate care. Inside the arrangement of lilies and roses, hidden beneath the stems, she planted a device no larger than a coin, a passive near field sniffer, that would capture the signals from Rourke's phone without detection. To any observer, she was simply ensuring the flowers caught the light just so, but Jameson knew the trap was already tightening. Dinner began with small talk, Rourke praising quarterly numbers, speaking of efficiency gains and market positioning, his tone smooth as glass. Jameson listened politely, his replies measured, his face unreadable. Mara moved between them, pouring wine, clearing plates, her presence quiet but steady, the eyes of someone who had already risked more than most dared. Rourke leaned back, confident, unaware that every vibration of his phone was being silently recorded. The evening played out as Jameson intended, a celebration on the surface, a test beneath. Rourke spoke freely, his guard lowered by luxury and the illusion of safety. Jameson raised his glass, his smile faint, while Wren's device gathered the invisible truths that would soon bring everything to light. Wren sat cross-legged on the floor of Jameson's penthouse, her laptop glowing in the dim light, lines of code scrolling across the screen as she worked through the layers of encryption buried in Silas Rourke's phone. Jameson stood by the wide windows, staring out at the glittering city, his hand absently twisting the wolf, crest ring that had begun to feel like both a shield and a weight. Arthur sat at the desk, flipping through hard copies of financial reports, his calm presence anchoring the room while Wren moved through firewalls and hidden servers with unnerving precision. Minutes stretched into hours until finally Wren leaned back, her lips curving into a thin smile, the expression of someone who had broken through another man's fortress. She turned the laptop so Jameson could see. On the screen was an invitation, sleekly designed, its words coded in the polished language of exclusivity. It was for a private sale in a penthouse gallery, accessible only by encrypted confirmation, a gathering for select clients who wished to acquire pieces of rare heritage. The sale was not public, no official records existed, and no legitimate auction house was attached. Yet the catalog was meticulously prepared, each item described in detail, accompanied by photographs that left no doubt as to authenticity. These were not replicas, not trinkets, but heirlooms once believed lost, now paraded for those with money and no conscience. Wren clicked to Lot 14, her voice cool as she read the description aloud. Blackwood Wolf crest ring pre-fireproof, authenticated by North Shore Heritage Assurance. Jameson felt the words strike him like a blow. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the image that filled the screen, the unmistakable design of his family crest, etched into gold, identical to the one on his own hand. The description went further, boasting of its provenance, claiming it was an original proof crafted before the Atelier fire, a piece whispered about but never confirmed. The price estimate was obscene, yet the promise of exclusivity made it irresistible to collectors who traded more in secrets than in gold. Arthur adjusted his glasses, his tone measured but sharp. "The same boutique insurer again," he said quietly. "The one tied to every suspicious payout Wren traced. They had not only paid claims on destroyed heirlooms, they had certified duplicates as authentic, feeding them into this hidden marketplace." Jameson's jaw tightened, his reflection in the glass behind the screen grim and unflinching. This was not simply fraud, it was a network built on betrayal, and now the proof of his mother's private commission was being dangled in front of strangers like a trophy. Wren scrolled further, showing the encrypted guest list. The names were cloaked in initials and codes, but she was already mapping connections, referencing accounts, tracing travel records. Jameson barely heard her explanations, his focus locked on the image of the ring. The wolves who guard turned into currency for men like Rourke. He had spent his life believing power meant control, yet here was proof that even his family's most sacred emblem could be stolen and sold. The invitation ended with instructions, a discreet elevator in a luxury tower, a password spoken at the door, anonymity guaranteed. Wren closed the laptop, her expression calm, her words simple. "Now we know where they gather," she said. Jameson nodded once, his voice low but steady. "Then that is where we will end this." The tower that housed the gallery rose like a shard of glass against the night sky, its polished walls reflecting the city's restless lights. Few people noticed the service entrance tucked in the alley behind it, a narrow steel door meant for deliveries and staff, but that was exactly where Jameson Blackwood and Wren appeared, just after midnight. Their van carried the logo of Sparkle Clean Solutions, the same company they had used before, and their uniforms were gray and unremarkable, the kind of clothes that made them invisible. Jameson felt the same strange shedding of identity as he had at the Gilded Steer, his billion-dollar name stripped away the moment he pulled on rubber gloves. He followed Wren's lead, pushing a mop bucket that sloshed faintly, while she carried a spray bottle and a bag of tools disguised as cleaning supplies. Inside, the gallery was silent, its polished marble floors gleaming under the dim emergency lights. Works of art hung on the walls, each one priceless, each one shielded by invisible webs of security. Wren moved with calm precision, her every step calculated, her eyes darting from sensor to camera before looping them with small devices that blinked once, then fell dark. Jameson trailed behind, keeping his posture relaxed, the picture of a weary night worker. Yet every nerve was taut, his heart steady but strong. They passed through a glass atrium and into a corridor lined with offices, the hum of ventilation masking their soft movements. Wren stopped at a door with frosted glass, etched with a meaningless title. She knelt, her hands moving quickly, and within moments the lock gave way with a soft click. She slipped inside, and Jameson followed, shutting the door quietly behind them. The office was sleek and sterile, but the air carried the faint scent of paper and ink, the smell of records too important to destroy. Wren went straight to a cabinet disguised as part of the wall, pulling free a thin black book, bound in leather. She opened it on the desk, and under the dim light, the truth spilled out in rows of coded initials, numbers, and notes, written with meticulous care. Jameson leaned closer, his breath caught in his chest. Each line told the story Angela had begun, commissions marked with double notations, one for the client, one for the duplicate. Payments were listed beside phrases like catastrophic loss and fire claim, words designed to launder theft into procedure. Some entries included small marks beside the artisans' names, coded warnings that revealed who had complied and who had resisted. Wren's finger traced the columns, her voice low as she explained what he was seeing. Artisans bullied into silence, paid off, or ruined if they refused to work. The initials stretched across years, a quiet betrayal woven into the heart of an industry built on trust. Jameson felt the weight of every line, the paper whispering of a scheme so audacious it almost seemed absurd. Yet here it was, black ink on white, undeniable, unflinching. Paper didn't lie, and this ledger spoke louder than any confession. He closed it carefully, his jaw set, his voice quiet but certain. This was the end of shadows. With this, the reckoning would come. Jameson returned to the modest apartment carrying the weight of the ledger still heavy in his mind. He found Angela sitting by the window, her hands folded in her lap, the dim light from the street lamps spilling across her lined face. Mara moved quietly in the kitchen, preparing tea as though the simple ritual could shield her from the storm of truths circling around them. Jameson sat opposite Angela, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. He did not raise his voice, did not let anger shape his words. Instead, he asked softly why she had never come forward, why she had carried such knowledge in silence, while men like Silas Rourke grew rich on stolen heritage. Angela's eyes did not meet his at first. They drifted toward the window, toward the night outside, as though she were staring into years long past. Her lips pressed together, trembling before they parted. She told him she had tried. After the fire, after the payouts, after the ledger vanished into shadows, she had made one call. She reached out to a number, whispered among artisans, someone who was said to listen when others would not. Her voice broke as she remembered the hope she had clung to in that moment, the belief that truth could still matter. For a brief time she thought she had done the right thing. Then the car appeared, a dark sedan parked across the street from her apartment, always at odd hours, always with a figure inside that never stepped out. When she walked Mara to school, the car followed at a distance. When Mara went to the store, it idled at the corner. For 7 days, it never left her sight. Angela's voice lowered, and Jameson felt the sharp edge of fear beneath each word. She had called again, desperate, asking why nothing had been done, and the line went dead. The calls stopped. No one answered her after that, her hands twisted together, the knuckles pale. She said the choice was simple then. To speak again was to risk her daughter, to gamble with a life far more precious than her own. So she had chosen silence, carrying it as a curse, watching Mara grow under the shadow of a threat that never quite vanished. Jameson saw her eyes glisten, though she blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. She straightened her shoulders, her voice steadier now, insisting she had done what any mother would have done, what she had to do. Jameson leaned back, his chest tight. He understood the logic, the impossible bind she had been forced into, but it did not ease the fury that burned beneath his calm exterior. Men like Rourke had counted on this, on fear being stronger than conscience, on mothers choosing children over justice. Yet Angela's silence had not been cowardice. It had been sacrifice, the quiet surrender of her own dignity for the safety of her child. Jameson looked at her then, not with judgment, but with respect, and his voice was low but firm. The fear that once caged her would not hold forever, not while he was here. The decision was made in the early hours of morning, when the city outside Jameson's penthouse still slept, and the fog of night clung to the skyline. He stood at his desk, the wolf crest ring resting on the leather blotter beneath the dim glow of a lamp. For years it had been his mother's private gift, a symbol of loyalty and guardianship, but now it would become something else. Wren sat on the couch, her laptop balanced on her knees, while Arthur spoke in his measured tone from the armchair, already outlining the legal pitfalls they would be forced to step around. Jameson listened, silent, then finally slid the ring across the desk and said it was time to use it as bait. Arthur did not argue, though his brow furrowed. He knew Jameson's instincts well enough to recognize the resolve in his voice. Through a shell buyer carefully arranged by Wren, the ring was quietly submitted into the catalog for the upcoming gallery sale. It was not given a standard listing, but instead marked as Lot Zero, a private teaser meant to provoke whispers among the elite who traded in shadows. The description was written to inflame curiosity. Pair restored, the catalog now boasted, authenticated by North Shore Heritage Assurance, available only to select bidders cleared for the private session. The language was precise, designed to strike like a match against dry kindling, drawing out the ones who believed they owned the secrets of duplication. Jameson stood at the window, watching dawn break across the city, while Arthur contacted an old associate in the Federal Art Crime Task Force. It was not official, not through channels that would raise alerts, but quiet, careful, off the books. They needed expertise in tracking heritage fraud, men and women who had spent years dismantling rings that turned stolen art into silent fortunes. Arthur's voice was calm on the phone, his phrasing deliberate, coded, ensuring no paper trail would betray their intent. Within hours, he confirmed cooperation, though the agents would move only if given undeniable proof. Wren monitored the auction servers, her fingers gliding across the keys, watching as Lot Zero began to ripple through encrypted chat rooms and private networks. Almost immediately, she flagged the response. Silas Rourke's device lit up with activity, messages exchanged with a contact whose name was hidden behind layers of proxies. Wren traced the trail, her eyes narrowing as she uncovered the fixer tied to the boutique insurer, the same firm that had underwritten every suspicious payout. The two men were already circling, intrigued by the possibility of a restored pair, hungry for control of something even rarer than profit, proof that their scheme could continue unchecked. Jameson turned from the window, his expression unreadable, his voice steady. He had spent years wielding power in boardrooms, bending markets with a single phone call, but this was different. This was not negotiation or leverage. This was war waged in shadows, using deception against deceivers. The bait was set, the mirror raised, and soon the men who had built an empire on fear and silence would see their own reflection staring back at them. The gallery penthouse glittered under bright lights, its marble floors reflecting the glow of chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations. Wealth hummed in the room as guests arrived in tailored suits and gowns, their conversations hushed but charged with the promise of secrecy and possession. Jameson Blackwood entered not as a hidden man in borrowed clothes, but as the seller, his presence calm as a lake, his tailored suit cut with precision, his face unreadable. The wolf crest ring was no longer a private token, but a lure, a spark drawing predators into the open. His steps were unhurried, his posture assured, and though his pulse tightened beneath the surface, he carried himself with the composure of a man who had walked into battle and already chosen victory. Wren moved through the room unnoticed, her black dress blending with the catering staff as easily as if she had been born to the shadows. Hidden beneath her tray was a small loop device, feeding false loops through the gallery's cameras, turning every angle into a mirror of stillness. To the security system, nothing unusual was happening. She passed close to Jameson once, her eyes flicking up just long enough for him to know everything was in place. She continued on, her steps smooth, her presence invisible, the silent architect of their advantage. Mara was there too, her uniform crisp, her hair pulled neatly back, a tray of glasses balanced in her hands. She moved with poise, her eyes steady despite the storm within her. To anyone else, she was a catering girl serving champagne, but Jameson saw the steel beneath her, calm, the quiet courage of someone who had already risked everything. Her gaze swept the room, and when it settled on three faces, her expression shifted. Later, when she slipped past Jameson to refill his glass, she whispered the truth with the barest movement of her lips. "Those men," she said, council aides and a developer, men she had served at the Gilded Steer while they dined with Rourke, their voices low, their eyes sharp. Jameson nodded once, his calm unbroken, but inside he filed the knowledge like a blade. The auction began with murmurs, the room tense with hunger, as each lot was unveiled. Priceless heirlooms, once thought destroyed, appeared in sequence, each one carrying the shadow of theft disguised as provenance. Bidding paddles lifted, voices called, numbers climbed. Then the lights shifted slightly, and the announcer spoke of something rare, something whispered about but never confirmed. Lot 0, a private piece, the pair restored. Gasps rippled through the room as the velvet box was placed on display. Inside, gleaming under the bright light, lay the wolf, crest ring, its twin to the one hidden on Jameson's hand. Silas Rourke leaned forward, his smug smile curling, as if this moment had been made for him. His paddle lifted with confidence, his bid strong, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a man who believed he held the world in his grip. Jameson's face remained calm, but behind the lake, smooth surface, his resolve hardened. The trap had sprung, and the switchback was now in motion. The wolves who guarded were watching, and the game had only just begun. The gallery had fallen into a hush, the kind of silence that trembles beneath anticipation. The wolf crest ring gleamed inside the velvet box, its golden surface catching every shard of light from the chandelier above. Collectors leaned forward in their seats, their whispers sharp and eager, the scent of expensive cologne and ambition heavy in the air. Silas Rourke sat smug and certain, his bidding paddle resting on the table, his expression a mask of triumph. He believed the moment was his. Then Jameson Blackwood rose from his seat, his movements deliberate, his face calm, the surface of a lake with storms hidden deep below. He crossed the polished floor and approached the display, every eye in the room following him, every breath held in the cage of expectation. He did not speak at first. He reached into his pocket, withdrew his own ring, and set it on the velvet beside the lot's counterfeit. The two pieces glittered together, identical to the naked eye. Twin wolves crouched in gold, guardians carved with mastery. Murmurs spread like a tide, confusion rippling through the crowd. Jameson raised his hand slightly and asked for magnification. The attendant hesitated, but obeyed, sliding a jeweler's lens over the first ring and projecting the image onto the screen above. Every curve, every line appeared larger, flawless, authentic. Then Jameson lifted his own, the one his mother had placed in his hand years ago, and slid it beneath the lens. At 20 times magnification, the truth surfaced. In the delicate etch of the artisan's seal, barely visible, was a dot so small it could vanish in shadow. Yet, under the lens, it glowed like a beacon. Jameson's voice carried across the gallery, steady and sharp. "This," he said, "is the true mark." A dot placed by Angela Dela Cruz, an artisan who gave her loyalty to the atelier and was repaid with betrayal. Gasps rippled through the room, shock tightening the air, the weight of revelation pressing against polished marble. Collectors leaned back, their certainty shaken, while some rose halfway from their seats in disbelief. Silas Rourke's smile faltered, the smugness draining as sweat gathered at his temple. He pushed his chair back abruptly, his hand twitching toward the exit. Across the room, a door bolted open, one of the aides making a desperate attempt to flee. But Wren was already there, her frame lean and controlled, her eyes like steel. She stepped into the stairwell, her presence quiet but immovable, and the man froze, trapped by a shadow that had no need to raise her voice. The gallery doors were sealed, the trap complete. Jameson stood tall before the crowd, the counterfeit ring still beside his own, the proof undeniable. He spoke not with anger, but with authority, the kind that comes from truth revealed in daylight. For years the wolves had been stolen, duplicated, sold in shadows, but the guardians had returned. The silence broke into chaos, gasps and scrambling footsteps echoing against marble, the empire of deceit unraveling before their eyes. And through it all, Jameson remained calm, the ring on his hand gleaming with the quiet power of wolves who guard. The gallery erupted into confusion, but the chaos lasted only a moment before order descended with the weight of authority. Two men in tailored suits, who had seemed like nothing more than other bidders, moved with sudden precision, their jackets shifting just enough to reveal the edges of holstered weapons. Federal agents, quiet and deliberate, stepping into the light at the exact moment Arthur Pendleton raised his voice. Calm as ever, Arthur carried a tablet under his arm and a thin folder in his hand. He stepped to Jameson's side, unshaken by the panic in the room, his voice cutting through the noise with the certainty of a man who had facts no one could deny. He laid the folder on the auction table, flipping it open to reveal copies of the ledger Wren had found, the one that detailed every duplicate commission, every coded initial, every false claim disguised as loss. His other hand lifted the tablet, screen glowing with emails that left no room for interpretation. The messages were clear, smooth correspondence between Rourke and the boutique insurer, each line dripping with kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, every payment tied neatly to auctions just like this one. He displayed chat logs pulled from Rourke's phone, encrypted conversations about heirloom matches and paired originals, lines of arrogance recorded forever in digital ink. The crowd fell into a stunned silence as Arthur's calm narration stripped the veneer from their world. He spoke without raising his tone, yet each word hit like a hammer on stone. Silas Rourke tried to bluster, his voice rising in protest, but two agents moved behind him, and his arms were pulled sharply back. The snap of handcuffs echoed in the room, louder than any gavel, final in its authority. His smug mask crumbled, replaced with the gray panic of a man who realized his empire was ash. One of the council aides attempted to slip quietly toward the exit, but another agent intercepted him, pressing him against the polished wall as cuffs closed around his wrists. The developer's aide, caught in the same net, sagged in defeat as the reality of exposure consumed him. Through it all, Jameson remained composed, his ring glinting beneath the lights, his eyes steady. He turned, gesturing not to himself, but to Angela Dela Cruz, who had been brought into the room quietly, standing in the wings with Mara close at her side. His voice was low, but carried to every corner of the gallery as he offered her the floor. For the first time in decades, the silence that had been forced upon her was broken. Angela stepped forward, her limp visible, yet her posture straight, her voice soft but unwavering. She began to name them, every craftsman who had vanished after the "so" called fire, every colleague who had been silenced by payouts, every life dismantled by fear. She spoke their names with dignity, giving them weight, giving them presence in a room where their work had been stolen. The gallery that once thrived on shadows now stood in light, the ledger open, the handcuffs clamped, the truth tied together like a bow at the end of a long, bitter tale. Jameson watched Angela with quiet respect, knowing the reckoning was no longer his alone. It belonged to every name she spoke into the air. Morning light spilled across the polished floors of the Gilded Steer, washing away the shadows that had once hidden secrets in its corners. The fire in the hearth had been allowed to die down, the air free of perfume and pretense, leaving only the quiet hum of a restaurant at rest. Jameson Blackwood stood at table 32, the one tucked near the kitchen doors where everything had begun, his expression steady, as he placed a small velvet box on the linen cloth. Around him sat Arthur, Wren, Angela, and Mara, though no one spoke until Jameson opened the box and lifted the counterfeit ring. He held it up once, the false shine mocking the weight of the truth it had carried, and then lowered it carefully into an evidence envelope that would be passed to federal agents waiting nearby. The lie would no longer haunt the room. He turned then to Angela, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on him with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Slowly he removed the wolf crest ring from his own hand, the ring that had been his inheritance, and placed it against hers. In her palm it looked at home, the gleam catching the daylight, as though it had been waiting to return. His voice was low, calm, but edged with respect, as he told her this was hers, the original she had once crafted, the proof of her artistry and her survival. Her fingers closed around it, and she drew a quiet breath that trembled before it steadied. Years of silence seemed to fall away in that single motion, and Jameson saw not just a mother who had endured, but a custodian of history restored to her place. Arthur produced a stack of documents, his tone practical, but his eyes softer than usual. A restitution trust had been formed, funded personally by Jameson, its purpose to compensate every artisan forced into silence after the Atelier fire, to rebuild the legacies lost in smoke and ash. Angela would oversee the trust, not as a figurehead, but as senior conservator of heritage works, the keeper of memory and guardian of truth. Her voice caught as she accepted, though her posture remained dignified, her years of fear replaced by the quiet authority of someone who had finally been heard. Jameson then turned to Mara, who stood near the table with her apron still tied, though her shoulders seemed straighter now. He told her that honesty was rare, that courage was rarer still, and that she had shown both when she placed a folded napkin in front of a stranger. He announced her promotion, Director of Ethical Sourcing, with authority that left no room for doubt. She would be tasked with ensuring the supply chains of Blackwood Holdings remained transparent and just, her voice carrying weight in decisions once reserved for boardrooms. Mara's eyes widened, her lips parting in disbelief before she whispered her acceptance, the sound as fragile and strong as new glass. At last Jameson placed both rings side by side on the table, his own and Angela's, the wolves gleaming in the morning light. They no longer looked like guardians bound in solitude, but companions side by side, no longer needing to guard alone. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.